6:06 GMT. Hello, this is Weekend from the BBC World Service. I'm Celia Hatton. Well, let's start in France. The first round of French parliamentary elections is set to begin, with voting stations opening in a number of hours. Polls suggest that votes for the president, Emmanuel Macron's coalition, will be close to those for the new coalition of left-wing and green parties under Jean-Luc Mélenchon. If Mr. Mélenchon's leftists win a majority, Emmanuel Macron will face huge challenges pushing through his agenda. Catherine Gilliardi is a French journalist in Paris, and she joins me now. Catherine, what's changed in French politics? Have left-wing parties fought elections together successfully before?
Yes, they have, but that was a long time ago. That was in the 1980s when François Mitterrand, the first socialist president of France, was elected. So it hasn't happened since then. Left-wing parties have been divided from the far left, different kinds of far left, and the Socialist Party, which had been very powerful for many years, lost its first presidential election in 2002 against a far-right candidate, but also 5 years ago when Emmanuel Macron unexpectedly became our president. He was totally unknown, and the Socialist Party was at disarray. So since then, another left-wing party, or let's say movement, has emerged, and Jean-Luc Mélenchon is at the head of it. And he had refused, or he had imposed such conditions for a union between different parties of the left and the Green Party that the union had been impossible until this presidential election, which happened this year.
So what's bringing this left-wing alliance together?
Well, because they believe in a third round, they say. You know, we had the first round, second round of the presidential election in April, and now they say this is the third round. Make me, says Jean-Luc Mélenchon, make me the prime minister, because in the French political system, like in many countries, if the parliament has a majority, then the parliament decides who is the prime minister. And this prime minister has more power than our president. And so it would be a cohabitation. And this is what the left believes, and this is why this time Jean-Luc Mélenchon has accepted also the conditions, and the other parties have accepted to unite with Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who was quite close to make it to the presidential election. So you see, we are in this kind of situation where you have new movements, Macron being still new because he was elected the first time 5 years ago, and this left wing called the NUPES, which is a new union of the left, actually, that's how it's called, and it's a real challenge to the president.
So, Catherine, what can you outline that challenge for us? What would a NUPES victory mean for Emmanuel Macron's agenda?
Well, it means that his agenda is dropped because he doesn't have the majority of the seats in the parliament, and it is the parliament which eventually makes it possible for the agenda of the president and his government to vote. Who votes the agenda. So no, it will be the end of Emmanuel Macron's agenda if we have a majority of left-wing candidates in the parliament. This is the first round, obviously. There's a second round, so we will know on the 19th of June. But they are challenged for the first time in many years. The center-right parties are challenged in this election.
Okay, Catherine, thank you. Catherine Gilliardi speaking to us from Paris. Well, the testy relations between two superpowers, China and the U.S., have been on display at a high-profile security summit in Singapore this weekend, known as the Shangri-La Dialogue. The Chinese Defense Minister, General Wei Fenghe, addressed the summit on Sunday, offering a fiery response to his U.S. counterpart Lloyd Austin's speech on Saturday. At issue, Beijing's strong view that China will eventually reclaim the self-ruled island of Taiwan. On the other side, the U.S. has been cautioning China against contemplating an invasion of the island. The U.S. is legally committed to help Taiwan defend itself. And throughout, the Ukraine conflict looms large in the background. The BBC's Nick Marsh, who's at the conference, joins us now. Nick, what's the Chinese defense minister been saying today?
Well, he's spoke about a lot of things today. He spoke about the South China Sea, COVID-19, North Korea. But as you say, Taiwan really was the big issue that everyone's talking about here, especially since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's got a lot of people worried in this region. And on Taiwan, General Wei was pretty unequivocal. He said any attempts to promote Taiwanese independence would be crushed. He said the People's Liberation Army would fight to the very end, not to underestimate their resolve. But remember, neither the United States nor Taiwan's ruling party are pro-independence for Taiwan. They prefer the status quo, which is obviously self-governance, but it was strong language from Wei Feng-he. It's an issue, obviously, that's been at the heart of what a lot of people have been talking about this weekend. You know, we had Japan's Prime Minister, for example, the other day. He said that Ukraine today could be East Asia tomorrow, which is a sign of how seriously people are taking the issue here at the moment.
Well, Nick, now how much should we read into the comments coming from Wei Feng-he or from Lloyd Austin? I mean, for the past few years, China has been issuing strong statements in regards to Taiwan, Washington as well. What's the mood like? Because the two men met on Friday and they both issued relatively positive statements after their talks.
Yeah, I mean, I was at a Chinese military briefing just after the talk, and they said that the meeting was undertaken in a candid, constructive and positive manner. I think the very fact that these top-level military engagements have resumed for the first time since 2019 does indicate a slight thawing in relations. I think both military superpowers know that some engagement is better than no engagement, but in terms of where both sides stand on these really big, important issues which matter not just to the region, but to the rest of the world, I mean, they are still deeply divided. Now, you can debate how much both defense secretaries or defense ministers' speeches were aimed at domestic or international audiences, but the fact is that we have two big, important military and economic powers who stand apart on pretty much every issue going, not least the issue of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which really has animated these discussions that we've seen over the weekend here in Singapore.
Indeed, Nick, have you got a sense of how closely China wants to be allied with Russia at this stage?
Well, Wei Feng-he, when he was talking about the relationship that Beijing had with Moscow, he called it that. He called it a relationship, he called it a partnership, not an alliance, so something which wasn't targeting any third parties. But don't forget that China is one of those countries that has refused to call the invasion an invasion. They prefer to talk about the Ukraine crisis. And Wei Feng-he this morning was kind of leaning into that image of the United States that China likes to put out there, the warmonger. He talked about this unnamed mastermind, although everyone knew who he was referring to, that was fueling the crisis, and that China was the responsible major power that was calling for peace and dialogue. Clearly we've got two big geopolitical blocks divided on either side of what's going on in Ukraine as well.
Nick, always good to hear from you. Thank you, Nick Marsh, speaking to us from Singapore. It is 14 minutes past the hour. You're listening to Weekend on the BBC World Service. Well, the U.S. President Joe Biden warned on Friday that the forces behind the deadly insurrection at the U.S. Capitol building in Washington last year remain a threat to democracy. He was speaking in the wake of an explosive congressional hearing on Thursday evening that blamed Donald Trump for an attempted coup, they said. A month of hearings are underway after a year-long probe into the riot, which was linked to 5 deaths. Our special correspondent, James Naughton, reports.
As an emblem of a divided country, the hearings are a perfect guide, because Americans can't even agree on what they're about. In a country where everything in politics is now so rancorous, that's maybe not surprising. But given what we've all seen, and what the first pieces of evidence at the hearings confirmed, surely it's clear that American democracy itself is on trial. Nothing less than that. For Donald Trump's supporters who speak of the Founding Fathers as godlike figures and the Constitution as the guiding principle of their lives, especially when it comes to guns and the Second Amendment, you might think that the scenes from January the 6th and the first evidence from people who were there would would be enough to make the case that there was a serious effort to subvert the results of the election by force. The Attorney General at the time, we know because he said it, told Trump that the claims of victory were nonsense. Crazy stuff, he said. Many in the president's inner circle thought the same, although apparently it didn't stop the former General Michael Flynn suggesting that it might be a good idea if the military started confiscating some ballot boxes. Yet despite the tears, the stories of blood in the halls of Congress, the evidence of groups like the Proud Boys who celebrate violence as necessary to politics, the big question across the country in the last 24 hours has been, who's listening? It's thought that around 20 million watched the live hearings on Thursday, a substantial number certainly. But viewers to Fox News were told that it was just a bunch of radical Democrats at it again, and the whole matter had been blown out of proportion. From Mar-a-Lago, Trump's base in Florida, there was a predictable blast. Bill Barr, as Attorney General, was weak and stupid, and no one should listen to him. Biden's election was still the crime of the century. However, other fiercely loyal cabinet members, Betsy DeVos, Secretary for Education, for example, have been telling the committee how there were discussions about invoking the 25th Amendment, the one that allows a president to be stripped of his powers if those around him think he's no longer capable of exercising them. And these discussions are said to have involved Mike Pence, the vice president, target of Trump's disdain on the day of the Capitol riot, of whom we now know he said, when told that the rioters were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," that maybe that's what he deserved. These are matters that are going to be laid out in up to 8 hearings this month, with more in September. And here's the question. Will they affect the coming midterm elections in November, when power might shift in Washington? Democrats are struggling on the economy and hampered by Joe Biden's often faltering performance. And they've been preparing themselves for a pasting, which will probably cost them control of the House of Representatives. You might think that the exposing of the Trump White House as at least as chaotic and divided as its strongest critics always said, and the evidence that's piling up of how much planning and encouragement went into the January 6th riot, would turn politics upside down. But no one's yet sure. There are some commentators who are saying that the detail of the committee's findings will put enormous pressure on the Department of Justice to charge the former president with serious crimes, but other legal voices say it would be a step too far. And meanwhile, the Trump machine continues to raise money, presumably for a presidential bid in 2024. Will these two worlds ever collide? The tribal politics that in the Trump era became fiercer and more unforgiving than ever before, and the committee's effort to make the case that American democracy itself was at risk on a day when a president tried to overturn an election result with the help of street fighters.
James Nolte. Well, let's get the latest on the war in Ukraine. The Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, says his forces have recaptured some villages and towns in the southeast. But he added that direct combat was continuing in Severodonetsk, in the eastern Luhansk province, which has become the focus of Russia's advance. Well, let's get more from the BBC's Joe Inwood, who's speaking to us live from Kyiv. Joe, we've got certainly a grim update from the Ukrainian president. What else has he been saying?
So the main report we have overnight is of this shelling, heavy shelling in the city of Severodonetsk, where the battle is increasingly difficult, increasingly bitter, and specifically reports of a huge fire at the Azot chemical plant. Now, this is a big industrial complex where Ukrainian forces are holed up. They're holding off the Russians as best they can there, but also 800 civilians are sheltering there as well, we understand. And this massive fire has caused an oil leak. Tens of tons of oil from radiators apparently have spilled out. And we don't have a clear picture, but it is quite a serious situation to have such a massive fire at such a significant chemical facility.
And Volodymyr Zelensky has also been speaking about casualties.
Yes, we've had varying reports of casualties. The best indication we've got so far is that 100 to 200 a day are being killed in the conflict in the east of Ukraine. And it's interesting because the Ukrainians are normally very cagey about their casualty figures. They've really not given an indication of running updates. They've told us about the number of Russians they think they've killed. They say they've killed 30,000 Russians. But they haven't been giving us updates. But now we are starting to get a picture, and it does seem that the Ukrainians are taking very heavy losses, very heavy casualties, especially in this battle
battle for Severodonetsk, which is becoming increasingly difficult for them.
Take us through what's happening in Severodonetsk. Why is it so strategically important at this point?
So it's an interesting one because Severodonetsk, which sits on the eastern bank of this river called the Seversky Donets River, in some ways you think it's not that important in military terms. It's on flat land and it's the other side of a river. But the Ukrainians are really trying to defend it. Now the reason for that is that it's the last big population centre along this twin city, Lysychansk, which is across the other side of the river, in what they call the Luhansk Oblast, the Luhansk region. Now this is one of the two regions that the Russians have now said are the focal point of their invasion. This is what they're trying to capture. So when they can take Severodonetsk, and importantly, it's worth saying, the other city, Lysychansk, which is the other side of the river and on a hill, so actually in a more defensible position, if they can take those two cities, then they can say they've got total control of this region. Now, if they can do that, that will be a propaganda victory, a PR victory for the Russians. They can start to say that they are taking entire regions. And there's even a concern then that they'll start to do there what they've been doing down in Kherson, and start to talk about integrating it into Russia, to annexing it, which is obviously an illegal act, but they would start looking at that process, and then once that happens, that becomes a very difficult situation for the Ukrainians.
And Joe, just briefly, any word on the Ukrainians' access to munitions? We've been hearing that stocks are running low.
Yes, so we got this yesterday in an interview with the Guardian newspaper. The deputy head of intelligence for the Ukrainians said they were nearly running out of ammunition of funds. What they're calling for is far more supplies from the West, because this battle in the East has become an artillery duel. Big guns pounding each other and the enemy positions. And the reason this matters is because the Russians apparently outgun them 15 to 1. For every one artillery piece the Ukrainians have, the Russians have got 15. And if you are trying to do a counter-battery duel, if you're outnumbered 15 to 1, you can't win. And so they say they need supplies urgently, and they need more advanced supplies and more long-range supplies. Now, these have been promised by the West, but they are not getting to the front lines yet, and it's making it an increasingly desperate situation for the Ukrainians.
Joe, a really thorough update from you there. Thank you very much. The BBC's Joe Inwood speaking to us from Kyiv. It is 23 minutes past the hour, and you're listening to Weekend on the BBC World Service. And now, Paul Sarist has the latest sports news for us.